Hello everyone, my name is Michael Hope and I am the Chairman of the British Youth Council's Youth Select Committee on Votes at 16. I'd like to welcome the witnesses to this afternoon session. Over recent years, the debate regarding the voting age has been intensified, especially as it was reduced to 16 for the referendum on Scottish independence. The purpose of this Select Committee is to review both sides of the argument for and against, and to assess additional yet crucial factors such as political engagement, political parties' views on young people and citizenship education. May I ask that all mobile phones are turned on silent and that you can engage with the debate on Twitter using the hashtag YouthSelect. I would now like to start with the first question from Jack, please.
In your written evidence, you have spoken about engaging
Sorry, Jack. Would the witnesses please like to introduce themselves? Starting with Professor Sarah.
My name is Sarah Birch and I teach politics at the University of Glasgow.
I'm Gottfreid and I'm a research fellow at IPPR.
And I'm Paul Whiteley, Professor of Politics at University of Essex.
In your written evidence, you talk about engaging young people in democracy. Whose responsibility is it to engage with young people? Sarah?
I think it's everybody's responsibility to engage with young people. Young people are part of our society. I think to say that there's any particular group who shouldn't engage with young people wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. However, in a democratic context, first and foremost, it's the responsibility of politicians to engage with young people as much as they engage with any other group in society. And unfortunately, we have a situation now where young people don't vote with such great frequency as older people, and so politicians don't actually have as much incentive to engage with young people as they do with older members of the electorate. And so, not surprisingly, we very often find they don't engage with young people as much as we would like them to. And I think that sort of a vicious cycle gets created where politicians feel that they don't have much incentive to engage with young people. Then young people say, well, the politicians aren't engaging with us. And so that they're turned off and they don't vote as much as older people, and then politicians say, well, why should we engage with them? They don't vote, then we're not going to derive electoral benefit from it. And so it's a very unfortunate situation that arises because of the mutual perceptions that are created by this disengagement and disaffection.
To back up Sarah's claim, I think that's right. Engagement in politics is kind of a two-way street, but what our evidence has found in the report that Sarah and I co-wrote, published in November at IPPR, was that there is this vicious cycle that both are self-reinforcing. So when politicians ignore the political interest of young people or poorer people or whomever, then they feel that they don't have an incentive to engage themselves with politics, so they're less likely to turn out to vote. So both are now self-reinforcing, and it's kind of this chicken or egg issue, what came first. But what we find is that it's a radical problem, and it requires a radical solution.
25 years ago, young people were less likely to vote than people of kind of middle and older generations. Now they're much less likely to vote. There's a real change have occurred over time in electoral participation by young people. When we did surveys in the British election study in 2010, I think the participation rate for young people in the surveys, if I recall correctly, was about 42%, when the turnout nationally was 65%. Big gap. And it isn't just about engaging young people, it has direct political effects, policy-related effects on the benefits given to young people as opposed to middle-aged and older people. Whatever politicians say, they will back people who vote when it comes to making hard choices about resources. So that's a background point. The thing I stress is to get people involved, particularly young people, there's two things that you have to think about, two broad things. One is people tend not to get involved if they don't feel they have a stake in the system. we know that people who have a big stake in the system, in the sense that they are well educated, in pretty good jobs, pay a lot of taxes and so on, they vote more than people who are not in that situation. And young people as such tend to have less of a stake in the system than older people, and that's always been true, but it's getting to a situation, to reiterate my colleague's point, where this vicious circle's removing them from the system. You know, policy decisions have been made which are really to the disadvantage of young people, and that may turn them off further. The other dimension, and I think in this sense, coming back to your original question, people who are interested in that community have a role to play in convincing young people that they should be good citizens. We found that a simple question in a survey that says, do you feel guilty if you don't vote? Older people of my generation really do, they feel guilty. And people in their 40s and 30s do. Young people, no, don't care. And this is very bad for them, because it means that they end up in this situation of potentially being ignored. So I think you guys, among others, have got a role to play in convincing your peers that actually they should take this seriously, and what's more, they have a duty to do it. And that is part of the exercise. So coming back to the original question, it's certainly true that all of us have a duty, but I think you guys do too.
Thank you. Brandon has the next question.
Why has the proportion of young people voting declined in recent years? To Sarah first.
Well, I think there are quite a number of reasons for this. I mean, the vicious circle that we've all talked about is one contributing factor, because it's a self-reinforcing mechanism, and so politicians pay less attention to young people are less likely to vote, and it goes round and round in a downward spiral. I think that's one factor, but also some of the things that Professor Paul Whiteley talked about just now. Young people just don't seem to feel as much of a duty to vote as they used to. I mean, sort of the generation of perhaps your grandparents who fought in the war, your grandfathers probably might have fought in the war perhaps, that was a generation where people were prepared to die for their country. A lot of people did die for their country, and there was a real sense of mobilisation, a sense of duty to country. And that was true in the 1950s and into the 1960s, but gradually since the 1970s, that sense of duty to country, I think, has declined. People have other interests, and people have simply seemed to have less of a sense of a duty to take part in civic decisions and civic life. Although still, I mean, the surveys that Paul has done and other people have done, it show that the majority of people do still feel that there's a duty to vote and to take part in politics, although that's declined quite dramatically among young people, and among young people that doesn't seem to be a majority view anymore. So I think it's partly the relationship between young people and representatives and politicians, but it's also some kind of attitudinal change on the part of young people that seems to be a generational thing.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that, I mean, yes, it's young people feel like that there's no incentive for them to participate, there's nothing for them to gain. And I'll just give a really quick example of what those consequences lead to. Sarah and I, in our research, we did a study looking at the 2010 spending review to see what groups were affected most by the spending cuts. And 16 to 24-year-olds were likely to experience about cuts equivalent to about 27.5% of their income, while all other age groups ranged from about 10 to 15% of their income. So when they see these serious consequences and things cut like the EMU, tuition fees rise, youth centers closing, all these things feed into what are they doing for us? Why is it important that I participate, help them get elected when their policy don't reflect my interests? But the truth is, nothing can be further from that. If you don't get in there, if you're not voting in high levels comparable to other age groups, then they are going to ignore your preferences. They're going to go after those that they know who come out to vote, those who they know are going to get them elected.
And that's a very good point on the side of the sort of cost benefits of this. But there's this issue of young people's values, not feeling somehow citizens, not feeling that they are linked to the community and have obligations as well as benefits from society. It's a difficult one. It's like becoming detached from the wider society, and that's another aspect, setting aside the issue of who gains and loses of this whole exercise. And it's a bit of a puzzle for us. So why is this? Why do we see this kind of thing when we know from our own students, teaching our own students, for the most part, young people are very interested in political issues in the broader sense, the big issues, global warming, poverty and so on. But when it comes to party politics, which they see voting as aspect of party politics, they're really turned off. And how to energize the broad interest that lots of young people have in politics, to make them, to mobilize them to participate more, is really the difficult bit, the puzzle.
Is political engagement and voting the same thing? And does the fact that young people don't vote mean that they're not interested? To start with Sarah then.
No, obviously it would be oversimplistic to equate political engagement and voting, because there are lots of different ways of being involved in politics. However, some of the research that Paul and other people have done have shown that there is also a similar phenomenon when it comes to other types of political participation. I mean, young people do get involved in some types of political activities, such as visiting websites that have some political content, or being involved in political issues. They are involved in a number of political issues. But when it comes to actually doing things, and there are a variety of different types of things that political scientists like us have identified, of actually actively being engaged in the political process, there still is this phenomenon where many young people at least are much less willing to do things than they used to be in previous generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all correct. Just to simplify political engagement with voting, is wrong in my sense. There are other forms of political engagement, whether it be protest, participating in some sort of campaign. But I think what Paul's point earlier was right, that young people do have high political interests, comparable to other age groups. It's just when it comes to the party politics that they get really, really turned off. So, this is something that needs to transform. We need to find a way to re-engage young people when it comes to voting as well, because this is what wins elections, and that's what drives party policy to ultimately make legislation. So we need to find ways to re-engagement in that form of politics as well.
The evidence tends to suggest that some forms of participation are effective. For instance, for the most part, protesting has effects. It's not always entirely successful, but it makes a difference. But the one thing out of all the possible things you can do by way of political participation that is really important is voting. Why is that? Because it changes governments. And a change of government brings potentially big changes in policies and outcomes. So the paradox is that the most serious, if you like, in terms of its impact, activity that you can do, which is to vote, is the one that we're worrying about most in relation to young people's activities. They're a bit more likely to protest. The age profile of protesters, there's more young people do that in proportion. There's more young people do internet-based sorts of things as well. In fact, there's a distinct bias there. But on voting, they are losing the plot, and this is arguably the most important form of participation if you think of participation as a way of influencing policy and outcomes.
In your opinions, do you think if nothing changes, that the voter turnout amongst young people will continue to decline in the next few years and decades?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the research that Glenn and I did together with our colleague Guy Lodge, that Glenn has already mentioned, it was published late last year, demonstrates that there has been election-on-election decline in youth turnout, and there's every indication that this will continue because of the vicious cycle that we've all mentioned. which suggests that this is really the time to lock in change, that we still do have an opportunity to lock in change and to get young people voting with greater frequency. I think unless something is done soon, we're going to go past a point where so few people, young people vote, that it'll be very difficult to reverse that.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Just to add a few stats to that, in 1970, the gap between the 18 to 24-year-old age gap and 65 and overs was about 18 percentage points in turnout between the two. By 2005, that was a 40-point percentage point gap. It closed a little bit in 2010 to 32 percentage points between the oldest group and the youngest group. But the overall trend is showing that there is a continuing decline. So yes, in my opinion, that this is going to continue as elections go by.
One thing to sort of strike a positive note, you might remember that citizenship education was introduced in secondary schools as a compulsory subject in 2002. And it's evolved somewhat over time, but since it was introduced, we've had 10 years or more, and now we're able to evaluate the extent to which it's successful or otherwise. And there's a number of research papers out there, including work I've done with others, on this, and it makes a difference. If you are exposed to citizenship education curriculum, which talks about, citizenship in a broad sense, it raises the chances of you voting, raises the chances of you participating in other ways, and has a positive effect. I don't want to say it's, the be-all and end-all, but it certainly was a positive development. And one thing I think is important is to protect that, to make sure that it continues, and it is continuing under the coalition government, and not marginalise it. There was a point where it looked as though it might be dropped as a compulsory subject and become a kind of marginal subject, and that would be a very bad idea. So there are positive things that one can do, and that would be an example, I think, of something we can do to oppose this trend, this disturbing trend that we've talked about.
Okay, Thea has a question.
Earlier on, we spoke about the lack of party political knowledge given to people during citizenship education, and you've also mentioned that in young people there seems to be a lack of party political interest. Do you think those two things are linked in any way?
There is undoubtedly a link, although I wouldn't put all the faults at the people who do citizenship education. There are definitely going to be inherent limits in the extent to which they can really talk about political parties and so forth, because the mums and dads are undoubtedly going to accuse teachers of bias if they get too much into that. But certainly I think there could be a lot more that could be done to educate people in citizenship education about the electoral process, the political process, the general institutions. But also I think it's not just citizenship education that takes place in schools. When I was in the Netherlands last week talking about why it is that young people there vote more than they do in the UK, and the professor I was talking to mentioned the fact that these online systems that I don't know if you're familiar with, we do have them here in the UK. I know we had them at the time of the last London elections. You can put in your preferences on different issues. You go into this website and it says, what do you think about the environment? And what do you think about this political issue, that political issue? And then it gives you a recommendation of which party to vote for. And he said, well, all the young people use that. They all go online and find these vote advice systems, use it quite frequently, and that is one of the reasons why it helps them to educate them about politics. And so I think other youth organisations and other organisations in civil society could potentially work alongside the formal citizenship education that takes place in schools, and maybe complement some of those activities with other things that might potentially be a bit more partisan. So I think it's not necessarily just up to the schools, although I agree that the schools probably have a bigger role to play.
I think that's right. I mean, it's a tricky balance when it comes to citizenship education in terms of educating about certain political parties. You don't want educators to look biased in any way. But I mean, I do think that leaves ground, though, however, for the political parties to come in and engage more with young people in their schools. A very good friend of mine is a sixth form teacher, and he struggles quite often to get representatives of the political parties to come in and attend seminars and talk to the students. Quite often they don't want to engage, and I think that's a big problem there, and there's a big gap for political parties themselves to take over and educate, I guess, from their points of view.
Yeah, in the 1950s, the political parties, the major parties, had huge youth organisations. And a lot of activity went on. A lot of it was social. You know, it wasn't just sitting around talking politics all the time. A lot of it was a social operation. And I think probably young people would go along for those kinds of reasons. And so the parties were a place where you'd start to get exposed to politics, if you like. And if there were quite lively organisations, especially actually the Conservative Party, youth wing, so people would be drawn in for other reasons to politics. Now, the sad truth is, and this is pretty evident across the advanced industrial world, not just in Britain, is that parties as voluntary organisations are dying out, disappearing, poof. And this is a really serious development. And it means that young people are affected by that because there's no longer these organisations which they might sort of go along to, wondering what's all this about. I'll go along and find out, and get drawn in because the institutions are no longer there to do this. And so I'm not surprised, to take the point my colleague made, that parties don't go along to sixth form classes because often they don't have the people to do it. So we've got to see this against a wider problem of the decline in voluntary activities in parties. I won't go into the details of why that's happened and so on, because it strays somewhat from what we're talking about. But it is one of the drivers of the failure to get young people involved, that parties are no longer seen as something that young people should get involved in.
Thank you. I'd like to pass you over to Philip.
It came mainly from Glenn's initial response to our investigation, but you've all talked about it today, so we'd like to get all your opinions on this. You've all spoken about the vicious cycle of engagement and turnout. Can you, Glenn, firstly explain what you believe that means?
Well, the vicious cycle, what we mean by that is that you have the political parties on one hand, voters on the other hand, particularly young voters. And what happens is you have young voters looking at the politicians saying, well, they're not really speaking to me, they're not really reflecting my interests within their policy ideas, so what incentive do I have to turn out to vote? Then the politicians then look at young people per se and say, well, they're not turning out to vote, so why should we reflect their political or interests in our policy ideas? So you've got these two groups self-reinforcing one another to essentially not listen to one another, and this is a problem because this is simply strengthening, because what's happening because of this is what we're finding is that young people are turning out at elections less and less, and politicians are listening to their policy interests less and less.
And then all three of you have already touched on potential things to fix this, but could you give us some more ideas as what we could do to stop that vicious circle and potentially reverse it? All three. Well,
on my organization, the report that I co-wrote with Sarah and Guy Lodge, we call for a radical policy idea to conquer this, and that's first-time compulsory voting. Now, the idea there is that somebody would have to turn out to vote on their first eligible election, and that includes also people that have just become new citizens, in addition to young people. But what we find in our research, and others have found in the research, is that voting and not voting is habitual. So if you go out and you turn out to vote once, you're likely to do so through the duration of your life. If you don't turn out to vote in your first election, you're more likely to not turn out in subsequent elections. Your life. So what our idea does is that if young people are required to go out and vote, and they're not actually required to vote for a party, they're just required to go to the polling station and to, put in a ballot, because there would be a none of the above option. So as long as they do that, we find that they're more likely to continue to vote through the continuation of their life.
Okay, Paul, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, As I mentioned earlier, I find with my students, and I'm sure you find this too among your friends, is that it's not that young people are not interested in politics at all. They are very, but these are non-party political related issues. I mean, the environmental issues, the concerns about global warming, all these things, I find that young people are very interested in those kinds of things. So one thing I think one can do is criticise the parties for not addressing issues that young people think about and focusing too much on technical, I think, and managerial issues, which don't inspire in the same way that the big issues of the future of the planet and so on. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, but it doesn't figure greatly often in the discourse, which tends to be for a lot of people, about technical policy-related issues. In other words, I'm talking about trying to communicate to young people in a way that they will understand and will be enthused about, instead of talking in terms of detailed technical policy issues. So it's partly a communication exercise, and I think politicians can be criticised for not doing it very well.
Do you think lowering the voting age and therefore increasing the number of potential voters in the lower age ranges would force politicians to then listen to those age groups, whether or not they turned out to vote?
Oh yeah. Some of the policies that you could argue are not to the benefit of young people wouldn't have been passed. Let me just give you an illustration. I've got a bus pass that's free. I can ride around on a bus that's free. Do I need this? No. They should take it away from me. But they won't. Why? Because people like me vote. They take it away from you lot because people like you don't. That's it. It's as stark as that.
And then Glenn and Sarah, could we get your opinion on that as well?
I agree. Politicians need a reason to do things. You can say, oh, well, politicians should do this, they should pay attention to young people, they should do this and that and the other. Politicians are like the rest of us. They're going to do something if they have a good reason to do it. They're going to do something if it's in their interest. And politicians are always thinking about the next election. So that's why I think we've proposed first-time compulsory voting. And the compulsory element, you might say, oh, well, compulsory is really bad. But it's only asking people to go to the polling station once in their lives, so maybe 15 minutes, which compared to all the other things that are compulsory for many young people, not least to school, is not a very big ask. But the real compulsory element with first-time compulsory voting is it makes it compulsory for politicians to pay attention to young people. And we think this would work best if it were introduced in combination with voting at 16. It would be much easier for various logistical reasons to introduce first-time compulsory voting if the voting age were lowered to 16. And we think the combination of those two things would be sort of a very powerful incentive to make politicians listen to young people. And just exhorting them, saying, oh, well, you should, isn't going to do the trick. It hasn't done the trick up to now. And I think we need for firmer measures that there be some serious, to seriously wake politicians up and compel them to listen to people your age.
And you think that would help to reverse the vicious cycle you've spoken of?
Certainly. I mean, just to point there, in 2010, 65 and overs, the turnout rate was 76%. Now imagine if you lower the voting age to 16 and require everybody that first eligible election to go out and vote. If you have 16 to 21-year-olds voting at something around 90 to 95%, that's a strong political group there.
And don't see it as compulsion, because I think it could be tied in with citizenship education in the schools and be a project for people. Part of the exercise of learning about citizenship is, on Thursday you have to go and vote, and we'll set it up in the school. You don't have to vote for one party or another, and you can choose none of the above if you really want. So it's not compelling people to, take one side or another. But part of the exercise is you vote for the first time, and we'll show you how to do it. And I think a lot of young people would quite like that, actually.
Something you said there. So would you suggest putting more polling stations in schools?
Oh yeah, sure. The new technology means that we can do this now, and the barriers which traditionally have existed really aren't a problem. This can be sorted, and I would have polling stations in all the schools, and I would have everybody who's got citizenship education, if we had voting at 16, of course, because it's the last year of compulsory education, I would have them as part of the curriculum being asked to, right, today's exercise is you go and vote. And you'd get a high turnout there. And I think some of the people involved, instead of regarding it as, something that they have to do and it's awkward and they don't want to do it, would actually think it was quite fun. It might work quite well in the school setting.
Thank you very much.
If I could just add something to that.
Very briefly, if you would.
Yes, a technical change recently. There's, electoral registration is going online, as I'm sure you know. This means that in theory, you could allow people to vote anywhere in their local authority area. There's some technical issues that need to be overcome, but that means that people could vote in the school that's nearest to them, even if it wasn't the one where they, in theory, previously under the old system were registered.
If Brandon could ask the next question.
If young people don't want to vote, isn't that their choice, and why shouldn't we just leave them to it? And start with Sarah.
I understand that view, and I think it is a view that's held by a lot of people, but you have to weigh up the desire of people to do something or not to do something with other considerations. And I think when it comes to civic life, I think people do have a duty to contribute, and that duty is one it's a duty to other people their age and also to society as a whole. So it's about rights, balancing rights and duties, and that's why the suggestion of first-time compulsory voting is only asking people to do it once. And we think that that is a small ask in comparison with the huge benefit of locking in that duty.
That's right. I mean, as citizens, we're required to do lots, and young people are required to do lots, and receiving an education being one of them. Like Sarah says, this is a very, very small thing, and we don't think it's a silver bullet. It needs to be tied in with enhanced citizenship education and perhaps lowering the voting age to 16. But we feel that all these things will simply empower young people, and that would help re-engage them into the political process.
Yes, in a theoretical sense, I suppose you can argue, people have the choice not to participate, but that's like saying, they have a choice to not participate in the wider society and not to get to know their neighbours, not to get involved in the local community. They certainly have a choice, but I'm not sure many people actively want to do that. It looks to me, in the case of young people, that a lot of it is they don't understand this, they're not quite sure about it. Mum and dad may not vote, so they don't take them along to the polling station, so they, what's all this about? I don't want to do it. Whereas if you facilitate it through the schools and make it an exercise, you change that. And then having done it once, then they'd know what was involved, and I think that would help them. So I don't think there's many people consciously saying, I've got the right not to be involved.
If we can move on to the Shaquille with the next question.
Well, I'm kind of touching back on the point of you were saying about a distrust among young people. You've linked low turnout to a distrust in politicians, and given that young people turn out the least, do you think that they have the lowest trust in politicians? And you talked about how young people are turned off by party politics. Can you tell me what aspects of party politics you think that refers to? Why are they so turned off by party politics? What's really having an impact on them? A negative impact? I've kind of lost it.
That's really Paul's department. He's the big survey researcher. He knows the attitudinal stuff better than I do.
If you look over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a big decline in trust in politicians across the board. So it's not just young people. They're not the most mistrusting. And after the expenses scandal, which you remember surfaced a few years ago, boy, trust plummeted, and it's come back a little bit. So I don't see young people as being significantly different from the rest of the population in terms of trust. There's a lot of mistrust out there, and young people sharing that a little bit. And of course, politicians have to clean up their act to make sure that this mistrust eventually goes away. So I wouldn't say it was accurate that young people are more likely to mistrust politicians, and that's why they don't get involved. You've got to see it slightly differently. Curiously, if there's a general election, especially an election that changes a government, trust goes up. It's like people are inspired by a change of government, an election taking place, and getting involved, and it makes them a bit more trusting for a bit. And so participation itself can help to create trust, is what I'm saying. And that's why if we use some of these measures we were talking about to get young people more involved, they might become more trusting as well.
If we can go to the next question with Funini.
So we touched on this slightly, but I was quite interested to how it could be elaborated. Are there any other countries you've seen from your research where young people appear to be very well engaged, and what can we learn from them? So should we start with Sarah?
Firstly, there's Austria, where they've lowered the voting age to 16, as you know, and there's been quite a positive experience with that. And so certainly, the young people are quite engaged in politics there. And they have a history that's no longer the case, but there used to be compulsory voting in Austria, so turnout is still high for historical reasons, just because there's a culture of voting in that country. The Netherlands, which I mentioned just recently, they relatively high levels of turnout there among young people, and some of the Scandinavian countries also, but most European countries really have sort of higher turnout among young people and more political engagement among young people than in the UK.
Yeah. Should we go to Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, the countries around Europe, at least, that have the least amount of inequality between age groups are Belgium, that's because they have compulsory voting, even though it's not enforced. Sweden, Spain, Norway, Netherlands, and Germany. While at the bottom list are places like Switzerland, France, and Ireland and the UK. So there's obviously something going on if some countries have less inequality in turnout, while those here others don't. And a lot of this has to do with political party engagement. At least in Scandinavia, I know that Paul talked about how in the past there used to be strong youth wings of political parties here, but in Scandinavia there still are. Norway is particularly strong with their political parties and their youth programs. So perhaps that's part of the dynamic. But also you have to question the policies coming out of governments. Are they more policies that reflect the interests of younger people, and it's quite possibly so, at least in a number of these countries where inequality in turnout is more equal or less than it is here in the UK, for example.
These are structural characteristics of different countries, but there's something else too, which is the campaigns that parties run in elections, and we've studied this quite a lot, and they don't talk to young people very much. And again, it's an aspect of this vicious circle thing. They're looking at targeting voters who will swing to them in key marginals. So often the campaigns under our electoral system are sort of laser-like focused on people who can be won, and they don't seem to think that young people are part of that. And I often think that what the parties should be persuaded to do is to hire young people ambassadors as part of the planning process for the campaigns. Campaigns are now underway already in the political parties. In other words, they're planning for next year, the general election, and the preliminary things are in place, the spending is being raised, and it's going on behind the scenes now. Now, parties should feel obliged to have young people such as yourselves involved in that at an early stage, saying, look, we should do this. Why don't you do a campaign aimed at this group among young people? And get involved in the campaigning process early on, and that could make a difference. If you want to see how it works, it worked very well. It worked extremely well in the 2008 presidential election in the United States. Barack Obama first elected, and that brought a lot of young people in because it was a very kind of enthusiastic campaign, much more enthusiastic than his second campaign 4 years later. But it was very interesting to see how that mobilized young people and brought them in and they spoke to young people's concerns, and the campaign was able to talk to them much more effectively than campaigns are here. So part of the exercise is reforming and revitalising the campaigning of parties, as well as these issues of, comparative rates of turnout and so on.
Definitely. So are there any countries which have worse levels of youth engagement than the UK, and what are the types of causes of the disconnection in those types of countries?
Eastern European countries tend to have pretty low levels of engagement. Poland, the Czech Republic and Bulgaria and so on. Part of it is mistrust of parties, which is a legacy of the communist era, when, as you know, the Communist Party dominated and they didn't allow civil society to grow, and they would prevent other parties from being formed. And that created a big sense of reservoir of mistrust, which still is with us today. And it's affecting young people as it is everyone else. So if you want examples that are worse than Britain, there are examples. We don't have that legacy, and that's a good thing. So they have to overcome that, and it'll take years to do it. It's an additional problem they face over and above the kinds of issues we've already been talking about.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to Joe's question now.
Some of the evidence that we've received states that politicians design their policies to attract older voters. You've mentioned earlier about some of these examples. Could you give any more? And start with Paul. Any opinion?
Well, I would think, I'm pretty sure, and when you rerun history, you never know what would have happened. So it's all, in a way, a guessing. But I'm pretty sure that if young people voted at the same rate as their older cohorts, or near, £9,000 a year fees for undergraduates would not have been introduced. That's my judgment. I can't prove it, of course, but that's my judgment.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to prove where and where not. Policy would have been very different if the voter turnout rate for young people would have been much higher. But I mean, just reflecting back in the past 5 years, as I stated that example earlier about the difference in cuts in the 2010 spending review, and there's further cuts to come, so we would like to analyze that as well to see what the difference is in the new cuts. But yeah, I mean, tuition fees certainly one of them. The education maintenance allowance, scrapped. Youth centers, declining. While at the same rate, you have TV licenses, protected bus passes, as Paul mentioned earlier, winter fuel payments still there, and pensions triple locked. I mean, it's quite a difference in variation in terms of policy protected for one group and policy let go for others.
And Sarah.
Well, we've had a pretty comprehensive list. I think you could add to that sort of broader issues that will affect future generations also. For example, the recent, and I don't want to make a party political point, but recent governments' reluctance to really engage with climate change and to really do a lot to prevent climate change from happening. Some of these things are going to impact on future generations, so that the government's perhaps a bit reluctant to engage with those, because some of the older people who vote with various frequency, they don't have such an interest in what happens in the years to come.
Thank you.
Just to touch on a point that was made about the spending cuts affecting young people, if the voting age was reduced to 16, do you think that the turnout would be significant enough in order for parties to reevaluate their priorities and perhaps not target young services? Paul?
Well, that's a big ask. If. But certainly, I can imagine the turnout. And suppose, sort of brainstorming for a minute, suppose we had voting at 16, and as we were saying, it was compulsory. And as I say, that's framing it sort of in a slightly coercive way, but if it was in conjunction in the schools with citizenship education, it might actually be fun. They might enjoy doing it rather than, I've got to do this, I've been ordered around, And you would get high turnout among 16-year-olds. That pretty much, and the research supports this, would encourage them to vote again when they're 18, 19, 20, because having done it once, we know that it becomes a habit. And so you would significantly raise the turnout amongst that age cohort. That would wake politicians up, and it would make them much less willing to disproportionately cut young people's things that benefit young people as opposed to things that benefit older people.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to Orson now with the next question.
If young people were to vote, what would the effect be in terms of election results? And do you believe that some parties would benefit more than others?
If young people were to vote, yes, certainly. And Paul probably has a better sense of where marginal seats are that young people could probably tilt the outcome a bit more than myself.
It's actually unpredictable, this. At the last general election, young people were a bit... the youngest age cohort in elections, that's the 18 to 25-year-olds, were a bit more Labour than supporting the Conservatives. But in the past, if you go further back, it was the other way around. So it's not clear that one party is going to benefit from this more than another. And actually, imagine if the 18 to 24-year-olds had voted in the same rate as the rest of the population, 65% of them instead of 42%. If you do that, then the Labour advantage appears to decline. So if you get them involved, you get more Conservative votes, more Liberal Democrat votes, more Green votes and so on, as well as Labour votes. Although certainly at the last election, Labour had an advantage. Not a big advantage, but it had an advantage. And that, of course, means that it's tricky to sell this to non-Labour parties. But they shouldn't think this is set in stone and that it's always going to be the case, because in the past it's not been.
I think also you have to take into consideration the fact that all the political parties would respond to a large proportion of the young electorate voting. None of them could afford to just stand by and say, oh, we're not going to bother with those people, they support a different political party. So you would see a change in the appeals that all the political parties would make. So I think you have to be wary about simply sort of looking at which parties young people are supporting now and transferring that to a different context in which many more young people were voting. I think you saw the parties stepping up to the plate and addressing concerns of people your age.
Our next question is from Thea.
This question is directed towards This question is directed towards Glenn and Sarah. In your recent paper for the Institute of Public Policy Research and Democrat Audit, you said there are strong normative reasons for changing the voting age to 16. May I ask what those reasons are?
Yes, so I think there are a number of different reasons. The first reason has to do with the evidence we have from other places where voting has been introduced at 16. From Austria, there have been some pilot studies in Norway and Germany that suggest that 16, 17-year-olds actually are more likely to vote under voluntary voting than people 18, 19 and 20. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this is true. People who are 16 and 17 are more likely to be living at home, and so if their parents go along to vote, they might go along with them. People who are 18, 19, 20 are more likely to be in transition, moving home frequently. Perhaps they might be recently moved to a new place where they don't necessarily know where the polling station is, and there are lots of them maybe in university or just going into work, and so they may have so much going on in their lives that voting just seems really peripheral. So in that sense, I think if we believe our normative grounds that higher turnout is good, allowing younger people to vote is a way of increasing, I think it would increase turnout among young people in general and get those people in the habit of voting. And as Glenn said, there's lots of evidence that if people vote the first time they're eligible, they're more likely to continue voting throughout their lives. So on the grounds of participation, I think it would help to have 16, 17-year-olds voting. Also, 16, 17-year-olds, they're often in work and they pay tax. They are allowed to, under certain circumstances, marry. They are allowed to, start to join the armed forces, and they're not actually allowed to go into active combat. But they're allowed to do most of the things that older people do, and the decisions that governments make affect them. And they affect them, in some sense, they affect them a lot more than they do older people, because the decisions that governments make now will affect future generations as well. So they have a big stake in the decisions that our governments are making. And so on those grounds, I think you could argue that it makes sense for them to vote.
Also, do you think that 16-year-olds are ready to vote?
I think that's a judgment that society needs to make. There is evidence from psychologists and from political scientists and sociologists both ways. There have been psychologists who have looked at the cognitive structures of 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and there are different views on this. There are also various arguments that have been made by sociologists and political scientists as to the proportion of people, 16, 17-year-old, that have the cognitive and experiential capacity to vote, and there doesn't really seem to be a consensus in the literature. But I would say that it's not really up to academics to make that decision. I think it's up to society as a whole to have a debate and take a judgment as to whether they think that it's an appropriate thing for 16, 17-year-olds to do.
Okay. Do you think that 16 and 17-year-olds understand the actual differences between political parties if they were to vote?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to say that a 16-year-old can't decipher between political parties and where they stand as much as an 18-year-old can, I mean, my personal opinion, I think that's incorrect. I think that with enhanced citizenship education, and as Paul points out, that young people are interested in politics. They're just turned off by party politics, but I still think that they know the differences in what the parties stand for to make it, be active participants in the electoral process.
Would you say there are any risks associated with 16 and 17-year-olds voting that you can think of?
Well, the only risk would be that if you do lower the voting age and turnout does not increase, you could have less people being disengaged as they continue to get older. I mean, as we said, voting is habitual and non-voting is habitual. So if you lower the voting age to 16 and people are not voting, then there are more people that are going to likely not vote through the duration of their life. That's why we don't think there's one silver bullet to solve this problem. Lowering the voting at age 16 is, I think, part of the solution, but more needs to be done around it to have a full effect to get people re-engaged with politics.
And finally, do you think that 16 and 17-year-olds are mature enough to have the responsibility to choose how the country is run?
Again, I think that's a judgment that society needs to make. But remember that we don't bar anyone else from voting on the grounds of sort of cognitive ability. People with learning difficulties are allowed to vote. Older people who may, have dementia, whatever, they're still allowed to vote. And so I think some of these arguments that are often brought forward are slightly problematic. I think that the evidence from Austria suggests that when young people aged 16, 17 were given the franchise, political knowledge and political interests increased. And so one of the reasons why 16, 17-year-olds who aren't enfranchised, perhaps not so interested in politics, don't have so much knowledge, don't have so much political maturity, is they can't vote. Certainly we did see a step change in political knowledge and engagement and maturity among Austrian 16, 17-year-olds when they were enfranchised.
Funnily enough, that argument's been used for actually a couple of centuries to restrict the extension of the franchise. Are women sensible enough to vote? Are people who are working class, are they sensible enough to vote? Should we allow that? It's the same argument. But in the end, we've decided that they are. And above all, if you allow people to participate, they will learn. They will acquire skills. They will see that there's a stake in this, and therefore be motivated to get involved. And so I don't, to be honest, have much time for that argument, really. I think it's a little bit designed to ensure that the franchise isn't as broad as it should be.
If the next question can please be asked by Cydia, please.
This question is to Sarah and Paul. We have seen that you have done some research on the likely effects of lowering the voting age to 16 on both turnout and public attitudes towards the age of the electoral majority. Can you tell us about your findings?
Yes. We did a survey in which we are, and this is a survey, of course, of the British electorate, which included younger people, and asked them their attitudes to lowering the voting age. And what you find is that, first of all, this issue is not really on the agenda. People are not thinking about that. I mean, the bread and butter issues, for the most part, of jobs and issues that people meet every day dominate. And so a lot of people haven't really thought much about it. But when you start to model it, in other words, when you start to try to explain why there are variations across the country, you find that young people are more likely to be in favour of lowering the voting age than older people. But something else too, which is kind of interesting. The literature on participation suggests that people with a big stake in the system, who are, homeowners, pretty well off professionals, are more likely to vote than people with less of a stake in the system. So you'd expect, if that's true, that professionals and people like that would be more likely to want to extend the franchise to young people, to 16-year-olds. But they don't. They're less likely to. So there's a sort of reversal going on. They're more likely to vote themselves, but they're less likely to be supportive of lowering the voting age. And actually quite a number of them think it should be raised from 18 to 25.
And what
So
would you say the implications are for your research on the campaign to lowering the voting age to
Well,
16?
it means that you're going to get opposition from people who think this is a bad idea, and we think the reason they think it's a bad idea is that they want to protect their interests. It's always been true, when you look historically at the expansion of the franchise, that existing people who have the franchise don't want it to be, many of them, don't want it to be extended. And it's to protect their interests. So you have to have a campaign to convince them, and this has happened historically on several occasions in the 19th century and in the 20th century. You have to have a campaign to broaden the franchise, to make it as broad as possible. And that's still there. The point I'm making is that's still there. There are people who don't want young people to be involved because they know that young people's involvement might challenge their interests. And so you have to fight that one.
If I could add, I think once a change to the franchise is made, historical experience suggests that people will accept it. There are very few people now who are arguing that we should take the vote away from women or working class people or 18-year-olds for that matter, because the voting age used to be higher. And the experience in Scotland recently, with the voting age was lowered to 16 for the independence referendum, which is going to take place in September, suggests that something like that is accepted. I mean, there are obviously some people who don't think that was such a great idea, but all the debates that, I work in Scotland, all the debates that I've been hearing over the last year or so about the independence referendum, that the legitimacy of the outcome of the referendum, due to the fact that the voting age is going to be lowered, doesn't really seem to be a big issue. People more or less have accepted it, even to a large extent those who initially were against it. So I think once it happened, it would be accepted, and it wouldn't be too long before people who initially were opposed to it, before they kind of said, well, okay, that the voting age is a bit different now, we'll just have to accept that that's the new reality.
If we could just finally move to Jack with the last question. Unfortunately, we're running behind in time, so if we keep answers brief, it would be appreciated.
So this is Sarah. You've already talked about the fact that you recently suggested that voting should be compulsory for first-time voters. How do you respond to those who say compulsory voting would just address the symptoms rather than the causes of political disengagement?
I think that's a misconception. I think the cause of political engagement on the part of young people to a large extent is the fact that politicians don't pay attention to their interests. And the aim of first-time compulsory voting is to get politicians to pay attention to the interests of young people. The compulsory aspect of it, as I said, is really directed at politicians, not so much at young people. So I don't think it just addresses the symptoms. I think that's a misunderstanding of the proposal.
That's right. I mean, I think this isn't something that you can just simply tell people, do this, it's good for you, because that's not the point. The point is about empowerment. If all young people are going out to vote, politicians are going to be forced to listen to them. So that's what this is about.
Do you really think that it could be enforced if a large number of young people defied the law by not voting?
They enforce it in Australia, where it's compulsory for everyone to vote, and they have mechanisms in place to do that. There's a small fine that's levied. There is a mechanism that the UK could follow if it wanted to, and it's relatively effective. So yes, to a large extent, obviously there are always going to be some people who don't vote, and it might even be possible to introduce a sort of an abstainer position. If you really had ideological objections to voting, that you could apply through a relatively complex process to get yourself taken off the register, but make it so difficult that only people who are really, really, really objected to voting would be able to be conscientious objectors to voting. And most people, probably wouldn't do that. It'd be easier just to go along to the polling station.
And then finally, is there any public or political support for your proposal, and do you think that there is any chance of it actually happening?
Do you want to address the survey?
Well, yeah, we ran a survey. I think Paul actually ran it for us about just under a year ago, that showed that, surprisingly, there is support for the idea of first-time compulsory voting. Now, obviously, amongst younger people, there was less support than there were, surprisingly, with older people. But nonetheless, I think if I'd have to see the data again, but it was about roughly a third of young people were in support of it, but the largest number was, I believe, the don't knows. And that's understandable because this is in public debate right now. So it was simply a survey question where people thought about it that instant for the first time, likely. So this is a relatively new concept. So yeah, we'd like to explore more in terms of the data, getting this out in the public debate yet, which hasn't so much happened yet. But we've done a lot of media talk around this when we released our report. A lot of people are interested in the idea, even if people don't support it. People like talking and discussing about this because it's something new, and it's something that we believe would tackle the issue quite radically.
Yeah, about a third were in favour, a third were against, and a third didn't know. And actually, the proportion who were in favour was slightly larger than the proportion against. So, of those who had made up their minds, a majority were in favour. Although, you'd have to have a debate. We're not suggesting that Parliament should just pass a law tomorrow implementing this. There has to be. The idea is that we're proposing there should be a debate about the issue.
And to be fair, there isn't a militant group out there who want to say, take the vote away from us. So it's not like there's, at the other side, there's strong opposition to the idea of people voting as it is. So really, you're pushing at an open door with most of the problems, I think, of implementing this coming from the fact that people don't think about this very much. They don't think about constitutional issues very much, and therefore you have to draw it to their attention. And a good deal of apathy. And if it's established, then people will accept it because there isn't a big constituency out there saying we shouldn't do this at all costs.
We have run out of time. I would once again like to thank the witnesses for coming today to provide oral evidence to the committee. If you have any recommendations which you feel we should include in our report to government regarding votes at 16, then please feel free to send us any written evidence. That's the end of this committee. Thank you very much. Welcome to the fifth sitting of the British Youth Council's Youth Select Committee conducting the inquiry into votes at 16. Apologies for being behind schedule. I would like to welcome you to the panel. Would you be able to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name's Chris Waller. I'm the professional officer at the Association for Citizenship Teaching.
Thank you. If we could go to Shaquille for the first question, please.
What proportion of citizenship education does learning about politics and democracy represent?
That's a really interesting question. And if we go back to where citizenship education began as a formal part of the curriculum with the work of the late Professor Sir Bernard Crick, with the support of David Blunkett, who after the Labour government came to power in 1997 was the Secretary of State for Education, right at the heart of what the purpose of citizenship education was this aim to have young people to be knowledgeable, active and engaged citizens who were willing and able to think of themselves as political people. So when the curriculum was created, political literacy was writ very large. And within that, the key tenets of democratic systems, how democracy works, the institutions of democracy were very strongly badged, along with what one might call legal literacy, and also structures that enabled young people to look at issues around identity and diversity. However, since its inception in the curriculum in 2002, the citizenship curriculum has changed. And one might argue that certain aspects of political literacy have been weakened in the latest iteration of the citizenship curriculum, which will come into force in September of this year. So by no means has political literacy been manifesting itself in exactly the same way across the lifetime of citizenship education since 2002.
So do you believe, say 20 years ago, citizenship education played a more vital role in teaching people about?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that before there was a formal curriculum for citizenship education which brought political literacy into the mainstream of secondary school and also developed as a non-statutory part of primary education, political literacy was very much hit and miss. Yes, there was politics in post-16, but if you go below that, then political literacy was not non-existent, but was the gift of what one might call interested parties, teachers for whom this was a passion, and would bring that into the lessons in history or in PSHE. But what the citizenship curriculum did was to provide a firm home, a statutory home for political literacy in schools, and seek to try and raise the quality of teaching about politics and democracy in state secondary schools.
Okay, so you do believe that an increase an increase in the amount of citizenship education would?
I think it's not about increasing citizenship education per se. It is about ensuring that what citizenship education that is taught in the most effective manner, and ensuring that support for what Paul quite rightly pointed out, one of the most positive aspects of the way in which we work with young people around politics today, can flower rather than wither. And it requires more than the light touch that politicians have given it up to press.
Also, how could you avoid teachers being biased, perhaps not deliberately, when delivering lessons about political parties?
Well, I think you can ask the same question about the teaching of history. And I think the evidence is in this country that the professional teaching standards ensure that bias is, and partisanship is something that teachers are aware of having to avoid. But with specific regard to the teaching of citizenship, teachers of citizenship know that they have to embrace the most difficult aspects of what society has to offer, what we might call topical, controversial, and sensitive issues. And citizenship teachers receive a lot of training about how to manage those sorts of issues in the classroom so that they can help young people to explore those issues and not see them, as it were, in a black and white, right or wrong context, but to explore the grey areas within those issues. And they have very clear guidelines from the DFE about the importance of avoiding political bias, but also about the willingness to embrace difficult issues with young people and help them to explore those. So I don't think that is a real big issue in citizenship. The worry mustn't be in political literacy that teachers will be biased. It's more, do they feel competent and confident to help young people explore these issues, which I think is a very, very different issue to the one of worrying about bias.
Sorry, one last question, which I have to be brief. How would you feel about political parties coming into schools to campaign 16-year-olds?
Okay, so in the latest iteration of the citizenship curriculum, which was written after the coalition government came to power, and you remember Paul Whiteley alluded to the fact that citizenship at that point in 2010-11 was feeling quite vulnerable. The latest iteration of the curriculum actually specifically mentions teaching about political parties as part of the Key Stage 3 curriculum. That's for young people aged 11 to 14. Now that wasn't specifically mentioned before, so I think the challenge for teachers is to think about how they can work with political parties to avoid bias and partisanship, but also, as has been alluded to earlier this afternoon, to seek to find ways for political parties to engage with the teaching of political literacy in schools as with secondary school age students, as well as those aged 16 plus, and particularly those obviously in further and higher education. So I think there would be a willingness on behalf of teachers to embrace that as an opportunity, but there needs to be some critical thinking about how that relationship would work. But I don't think we should see it as a barrier to helping young people understand more about politics.
Okay, if Louise could ask the next question, please.
Would you support teaching politics as a separate subject from citizenship? Why or why not?
Well, I would not. And I think, again, our previous witnesses have touched on this. Citizenship education is a broad subject, as I've already illustrated, looking at a range of different political, legal, rights-based issues and now aspects of financial literacy. But it's not about necessarily just teaching political structures. Citizenship has as its real focus helping young people to think politically. And I think that can best be accomplished in the broad structures that there are within the citizenship curriculum. Whereas often politics, particularly at A level, has a greater focus on the structures of political institutions, for example, like Parliament, different types of government and so on and so forth, as opposed to helping young people to develop the skills, knowledge and understanding to think politically. So purely from that perspective, I think that citizenship should embrace political literacy, and that politics and the teaching of political literacy should not be divorced from the subject itself.
Okay, the next question is from Fiona.
So
progress, what would you say is the right kind of balance between theoretical education and practical things like school councils and the mock elections and community projects?
Okay, first of all, it's important to think about the context of citizenship education. You can see it in a curriculum context where the subject is taught. We should also see it in the culture of the school where things like student voice and school council are really important. We should also see citizenship education in the context of the community. How do we enable young people to gain the skills, knowledge and understanding about the way in which society functions to go and work with community partners and for members of the community, who might include politicians, to come and work in school? So I think it's really important to try and draw those things together so that young people aren't citizens in waiting who are waiting to go out and vote, but are actually taking part in politics in the school through student voice, through student council, through class council, through being involved in the appointment of teachers, school leaders and governors. But also gaining the knowledge about how electioneering and voting, for example, takes place when making decisions, political decisions with a small p, about how institutions, for example, like a school function. So that if you're going to have policies in school about behaviour or about smoking, you want young people ideally to be involved in those policies. But they need to have knowledge about why policies are important, as well as knowledge about how policies are written, how they're constructed, and how they can be agreed, especially if that's going to require some form of democratic process that includes voting. So it needs to ensure that you bring the practical and the theoretical together. And I think the aim of the citizenship curriculum has always been to try and do that in those contexts that I mentioned earlier, but also to try and ensure that teachers feel confident that they can engage young people in very practical ways, as well as helping them to gain that theoretical knowledge.
Definitely. So do you believe that the curriculum should include teaching students how to vote, how to register to vote, what types of different elections they can take part in once they're 18?
Yes, absolutely. I think if you didn't include that, then the curriculum would be the poorer, but also students, young people, whether they are 5 or 15 or 25, would be asking, so who is going to help me understand those issues? Where am I going to get that knowledge? Who's going to provide me with that experience?
Thank you. Thea has the next question.
A lot of evidence we have received is quite critical of citizenship education. How can we improve the quality of citizenship education, therefore?
Okay, I think the criticism of citizenship education is one that must be expected. The subject is new. People criticise the teaching of history, yet history has been taught in British schools for over 300 years. So I think we must expect that a subject that only came into being as a requirement of secondary schools in 2002 is still trying to ensure that it has a place and that it can be successful. Every 3 years, Ofsted writes a report into subjects, and the report in 2010, so that was the second report into citizenship education, particularly criticised the teaching of political literacy, of politics, pointing out that teachers lack the confidence, not necessarily the competence, to teach about political structures. So undoubtedly, if you're going to give teachers that responsibility, you have to ensure that they have the training. And at the moment, we are training less than 200 teachers a year. And in actual fact, in 2003, there were over 30 higher education institutions that provided initial teacher training for those wanting to go and teach citizenship. Next year, there will be 8. If you really want to ensure there's a trained teacher of citizenship in every single school in the country, we've got to do better than that. Secondly, the turbulence over the subject didn't help. Was it going to be included after the review of the curriculum in 2010? And indeed, some academics who came from a politics background wrote that citizenship wasn't a subject in its own right, but really was an adjunct of something else, like, for example, history or PSHE. So there needs to be strong political support, not soft touch, but real support for the teaching of citizenship in the same way that there is support for the teaching of maths, science and English. And then lastly, often schools do not give the time and the space for the subject. Some of you, I think I'm probably safe in saying, may well have experienced this subject at school, or indeed not. It may have been on the curriculum but was marginalised. I worked with 21 teachers in some professional development on Wednesday. Some of those teachers were allocated 4 days a year to cover the whole of the citizenship curriculum. That's ridiculous. How can you have coherence in what is being taught? How can you really help young people to dig deep into these really important issues about politics and democracy in 4 days a year? Schools need to be given the timetable space to ensure that the quality and the quantity of citizenship teaching is equitable. And lastly, I think we need to ensure that citizenship remains a GCSE and an A-level, so that it has the same badges as other subjects, so that parents and students and others will take the subject seriously and not try and marginalise it, or where there's a need perhaps to think about increasing maths time or science time or English time, immediately chop citizenship.
Thank you. I'll now move on to Philip, please.
Chris, do you feel that the gap between citizenship education, which traditionally in most schools ends at 16 with formal education, and voting, which begins currently at 18, do you feel that gap of between 2 and potentially 7 years for some people reduces the effectiveness of citizenship education?
I don't think that does reduce the effectiveness of citizenship education, because citizenship education, although non-statutory post-16, is often embraced by teachers and young people alike as being something that they want to study. So students will seek to strengthen what a school offers in general studies, or they will encourage the school or college to provide citizenship studies as a GCSE or AS or A-level. I think the thing that weakens citizenship is the experience that young people may well have had during secondary schooling. If they have not had the opportunity to develop thinking politically as a entitlement, then their interest in politics is probably going to be quite small. But I think there are also other contextual issues, some of which Paul alluded to. He said about the bus pass, didn't he? That older people would vote because they want to retain the bus pass, and of course bus passes are not provided for young people. Well, that's true, but when young people look at the cost of bus travel, it's not politicians who are going to solve that, it's Stagecoach or whoever the bus company is who is levying the cost. So often what young people are disenchanted about is not the fact that politicians aren't listening to them, it's the fact that the politician isn't the person who can solve the problem, it's somebody else. Because over the past 15 to 20 years, many of the decisions that are made about the services that young people want to engage with, and that they might therefore be persuaded to take part in elections over, have been privatised, and the power moves out of politics and into the hands of companies and individuals. And indeed this is of course happening with schools. So there's a contextual schism between how young people perceive let's get involved in politics because we can actually have an effect, to why should we bother voting when the cost of bus transport has got nothing to do with Westminster or indeed my local council. It's got everything to do with a big company who I can't affect. So I think it's these other contextual issues that are often the issue. I think, as has been alluded to earlier, and as I said in my evidence, young people are intensely political. What young person doesn't want to save the whale or take part in a campaign about climate change? But perhaps they feel that who those should be directed to are not politicians, but are others. And so the political education that they've had up to 16, which may or may not continue beyond that, does fire them up and fires their enthusiasm and hopefully does help them think politically, but is taking part in the electoral process really where they feel the decisions are going to be resolved.
Thank you. I now go to Orson for the next question.
Are people asking too much of citizenship education, and can a school subject really create a generation of informed voters?
I think it's important to remember that the decline in political participation isn't a thing of the 60s or 70s. It goes right back way beyond that. During the Second World War, indeed in 1944, when we were closer to victory, a book was published by the British government called The British Way and Purpose. It's not in print these days, but it outlined then, in 1944, a worry about participation by all, and not just young people, in democracy, in voting. So citizenship education is not the cure-all, but it is part of the solution, because it should provide a context for young people in particular to develop knowledge about thinking politically in attempting to resolve issues. But also, young people must have the opportunity to take part in practicing politics, right the way from early years through to post-16 education, so they don't see it as theoretical, that they do see it as something that they can engage with. So I do think citizenship is part of the solution, and we should be ambitious for the role of citizenship education in addressing some of these issues. But we need to nurture it. We need to strengthen it. We can't just introduce it and say, well, that's the solution. And certainly we have introduced it, and it can be part of that solution. But it does need that nurturing so that there can be practical engagement by young people with time in the curriculum, as well as having the opportunity to gain the theoretical knowledge and understanding about political structures in curriculum time as well. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, but not alone, and our expectations must be generational over a longer period of time than just the 10 years or so that we've had to date.
So therefore, do you think political parties or electoral registration officers should be more proactive in reaching out to younger people?
Yes, and one of the things that citizenship education has always sought to do is to build a community of citizenship educators. I think teachers of citizenship don't see themselves as experts. We know it, students don't, and we must be the arbiters of how the curriculum works. Citizenship educators see themselves as partners, for example with democratic services teams in local authorities, so that they can work to gain the knowledge and skills and expertise to help young people understand, for example, how democratic services work in a local authority and in a national context, and how the structures of government, including voting, actually function. So teachers and educators need to work with others, not have that burden thrust on them alone. So I think bringing in those experts, those with knowledge from political parties, from political services like, for example, democratic services teams, is all part of that strengthening that I'm talking about.
Thank you. Brandon?
Some evidence suggested that citizenship education is often carried out by teachers for whom it is not their main subject. How common is this, and do you think it's a problem?
it's completely common. I've already said that to you that I worked with 21 citizenship teachers, just as a snapshot, on Wednesday this week. Not only was the provision very bitty, but people's experience, and it ranges from the cookery teacher who is told from September 2014, in other words, in 3 months' time, you're in charge of citizenship because we need somebody to lead it. And that teacher has no experience of this curriculum area at all, and possibly the school won't even provide high quality professional development to help that person. And there are lots of examples like that where the majority of citizenship teachers may well be pressed men and women, or enthusiastic amateurs, one might say, who really have always wanted to do this, and now they're being given that responsibility, but still have had none of the formal training to teach the quite academic and rigorous parts, particularly of political literacy. However, the great strength is in that small number of trained teachers, so less than 250 a year, so under 2,500 since 2003. Those small number of trained citizenship teachers who are in the system. But not all of those trained teachers of citizenship are actually teaching just citizenship. They may have been recruited because of their ability to manage such challenging issues, to help deliver aspects of PSHE or RE or history. So the actual teacher community of citizenship educators in secondary schools is very, very diverse. Now, we wouldn't accept that in maths or science, would we? We wouldn't expect a teacher of home economics to suddenly step into the shoes of an A-level maths teacher without a lot of training and support. So why do we accept it for citizenship when we are so worried about the decline of young people in participation in democracy?
So do you then think this has a knock-on effect on the quality of the teaching, but also the confidence of the teacher?
I think it actually has a knock-on effect on both. Yes, the quality of the teaching and the consistency of the teaching. Because if you get somebody really good and they leave, how do you know you're going to get somebody who has the same qualities and qualifications? And it also comes over in the quality of the lessons. The teacher who is less confident is going to be less willing to take the risk in looking at some of these deep and meaningful issues, particularly around political literacy, with students. They may feel very exposed for their lack of political knowledge. So they're going to resort to simplistic activities that are not challenging and don't promote a sense of well-being about politics with young people.
You say in your evidence that you submitted that you have no strong convictions for either against for or against lowering of the voting age to 16. What would it take to convince you of one way or the other?
Okay, so I gave evidence on behalf of the Association for Citizenship Teaching, and the association does, as I said in my evidence, not have a vision either way. It knows that young people already participate in democracy and take part in voting in school councils and in other spaces and places in schools. So we're not worried about a lack of skills in terms of young people taking part in voting. But most important for us is to strengthen citizenship so that young people are enthused to take part in voting in national elections. And that is what we really concentrate on. If you ask me personally, for my opinion, I would say that myself and probably the majority of citizenship teachers are enthusiasts for the age being lowered from 18 to 16. That wouldn't be the issue. It is the context that we focus on in our desire to strengthen the number of young people who might be persuaded to become more actively involved in voting in national and local and European elections.
Thank you. Louise?
Why do today's young people need citizenship education when people voting now didn't receive it?
Well, I don't think it's true to say that young people in the past haven't received citizenship education. Citizenship education has always been a part of English schooling, but not necessarily as a formal subject, and often aspects of it torn apart from the whole and embedded and realizing themselves in other subjects, for example in geography or in PSHE, life skills, careers and history. The challenge I think that we face now is more complex because our expectations of politicians have changed. And as I've already alluded to, perhaps our expectations are misplaced, and that politicians can't deliver on all the things that we want, which possibly has led to this increasing sense of disenchantment by young people with national politics. But young people are wedded to politics. They are enthusiasts for politics. And they do engage successfully in local issues, in local politics. Not always in a formal way, but often in informal contexts. So I don't think it's about suggesting that in the past people didn't have citizenship education or political education and voted more. I think it's more that society is changing around us and we need to find a way to respond to that. Every other Western-style democracy has some form of citizenship education or civics education or education for human rights and democracy. So we're not bucking a trend by embracing this. We just need to be more consistent in the way in which the subject is represented at school and take its ambition more seriously, as your colleague Orson was alluding to earlier. That if we take it more seriously, then we will make a lot more progress and we will see that impact. But it's not just going to happen over this decade that we've had. It's going to take longer than that. So we need to have faith in the efficacy of citizenship education as a change agent.
Thank you.
Thank you. On to Joe for the last question, please.
In your experience, how do new technologies such as social media affect how young people learn about political issues and current affairs?
I think, as already it was suggested by a previous witness, that new technology is a great opportunity for strengthening political literacy in formal education. The use of smartphone technology, the use of voting devices in teaching about politics in school is increasingly embraced by teachers who are starting to see the mobile phone not as a threat and a problem of students texting under the desk, but a real opportunity to use smart technology in a smart way to address difficult issues that obviously political literacy embraces. But also young people can take the opportunity of using new technology in informal ways to address political issues. And I think I did mention in my evidence about the young people who mounted a Facebook campaign in Plymouth where one of their schoolmates was being threatened with deportation, and it was a very successful campaign. It involved no formal structures at all, and indeed when young people approached their local MP, the local MP was on holiday, and when they returned they did not seek to engage with those young people. So they made use of new technology to promote their campaign in a political way that was successful, but was outside the formal political structures. So I think there's real opportunity here. But teachers need to embrace this new technology and not worry about understanding how it works, but worrying more or embracing more the opportunity of seeing how it can be experimented with. And in many respects, the young people that we work with in school are those who will help teachers in using this technology.
I'd like to once again say thank you for coming to provide oral evidence and for providing written evidence to us also. If you have any recommendations which you feel we should include in our report regarding votes at 16 to the government, please feel free to send us further written evidence if you want to do so. That's the end of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the sixth and final sitting of the British Youth Council's Youth Select Committee, conducting an inquiry into votes at 16 for today. I would like to welcome you to the session and apologies for starting late. We will have to finish at 4 o'clock, so unfortunately this session will be slightly shorter. Can you please introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I'm Helena Dollimore. I'm the Vice Chair Policy of Young Labour.
I'm Griffith-David. I'm the Policy Officer of Liberal Youth.
Thank you very much. I believe the first question is with Shaquille.
First of all, what is your policy on lowering the voting age to 16 and why?
Should I start? Yeah. So the Labour Party's policy on votes at 16 is very similar to Young Labour's policy on votes at 16, and it's got a kind of twofold approach. The Labour Party is in favour of introducing votes at 16. Ed Miliband announced that at the last Labour conference in September last year. But we believe that any move to introduce votes at 16 must be accompanied by a wider action to engage young people more in the political process, because we think introducing votes at 16 on its own would not simply be enough. So the first aspect of that is that we believe at 16 you are mature enough to vote and you should be given the right to vote. I'm sure you've heard evidence from lots of people today who have kind of said young people can do all these things. They can pay tax, they can change their name by default, they can get married, they can join the army, they can be the director of a company. In fact, they pay £500 million in tax every year, but they can't vote. And Labour simply doesn't believe that that's because people aged 16 aren't mature enough, and we think that they should be given the vote. And the second aspect of the party's policy towards votes at 16 is that we think you must accompany giving the vote with a move towards the wider engagement of young people. Now, the specifics of that are still kind of in the development process within the Labour Party. We have a formal policy process called the National Policy Forum, which is in the process of meeting at the moment and formulating proposals. And that will kind of be concluded nearer the 2015 election. But some ideas that have been put forward by people within the party, obviously these aren't official party policy at the moment, but they're in the stages of development, are ideas around introducing mock elections in schools, introducing much more comprehensive citizenship education in schools, and that's kind of Labour's policy towards that. And we think that the purpose of giving young people the vote, as well as it just being something that should be done because they are mature enough and they should have the right to vote, we also think that if done properly, with proper kind of education to help them to engage in the political process, it would also increase the turnout of young people in elections. Obviously, we see at the moment 18 to 24-year-olds vote in much lower numbers than older people. I think there's been a poll by Hansard that says if young people age 16 were to vote, a very small percentage of them at the moment express a willingness to engage. But we hope by empowering them with that right to vote, we would see a change in those figures. And like I said, accompanied with other changes to engage and educate people. I've mentioned some of those other ones that have been put forward within the party are, obviously at the moment there's a move to make education compulsory up to 18. People who are currently in year 9, I think, will be staying in school until they're 18. And this is a real ideal opportunity to introduce votes at 16 and engage people civically within their schools, because we've got people in school until they're 18, so we can really make use of that to engage them in the political process. So yeah, to just kind of summarise, Labour's policy is twofold. We think people at 16 are mature enough to be given the right to vote, and we're looking to introduce that in the 2015 manifesto, but we think it should be accompanied by a wider progress towards educating and improving young people's engagement in policy. That it should not be done alone. We fear the consequences of doing one without the other, because evidence shows that when people vote at a young age, that forms their habit for life. So if they don't vote at their first opportunity to vote, that habit will stay with them for life. They won't vote later in life. But conversely, if they vote at their first opportunity, they're likely to carry on voting. So that early age is a really crucial habit forming stage.
Morgan, have anything to add?
Okay. Just like to say that it's Liberal Youth and the Liberal Democrats' policy to introduce votes at 16 has been for quite a while. It was actually, I think we're the first major party to adopt this back in the 80s. It was, as I said in my evidence, it was a Liberal Democrat MP, Lord Wallace, Jim Wallace, who brought it up first in the House of Commons back in 1985. So it's something we've always been very firmly behind. We think it should be introduced for all elections in the UK, Westminster, devolved administrations, local government, MEPs. I think it's fair. The reasons are, as you've heard several times today, the rights and responsibilities that 16-year-olds have. 16-year-old can become the director of a company, can agree to join the army, can consent to medical procedures, but it's simply ridiculous that they can't currently vote on how those things work. They can't vote on how the health system works, despite the fact they can consent for their own medical procedures. They can agree to join the army, but they can't vote on defence issues. It just seems pointless. So we do support votes at 16 in all elections, and that's been our policy for ages. Regarding things like education, we do also think that political education's absolutely vital in order to especially drive up levels of engagement among younger people, but voting at 16 and political education are both very important issues and should both happen regardless of whether they happen at the same time. We need to improve the political education in this country, because I'm not convinced that any government has ever got it quite right. I think it always needs to improve. I also think votes at 16 is important. It doesn't necessarily have to be with improved political education, but both should definitely happen. We have, in, for example, our 2001 manifesto, tied them together because they are linked as policies, but I think they both stand up in their own right as important policies. And I think that's about it. There's simply no reasons to, as far as I'm really concerned, oppose votes at 16. It's just clear from the responsibilities that you face that 16-year-olds should have the opportunity to take part in the democratic process, and it is important to have political education to drive up those voting levels.
Thank you. I'll pass you on to Orson for our second question.
The perception is a younger electorate would benefit both of your parties. Is this policy just to get more votes, or do you genuinely believe that lowering the voting age will benefit society?
I haven't seen the evidence about which way introducing votes for young people would go. I'm not so sure it would be such a clear-cut picture. I think we need to be really careful when we talk about involving young people in politics. I think there's a tendency by mainstream politicians, and also often by youth organisations ourselves, to kind of pigeonhole the issues that young people are interested in as being young people's issues, like tuition fees, education, public transport. But I do think, whilst those issues are often really important to young people, they also care about the main issues that grown-ups, if you like, care about. I think they care just as much about the NHS, about policing, about the economy, and I think we've got to be really careful when we talk about young people's issues, and remember that young people will grow up to be adults who will care just as much about other issues in the political system. So from that point of view, I wouldn't necessarily accept the idea that introducing votes at 16 is some kind of political ploy. I think it's an issue of principle that should be introduced because, like as I've outlined, it simply doesn't make logical sense for young people to be able to do all these things legally in our system, and for the law to kind of recognise young people who are aged 16 as adults in some legal senses, but not in others. It's an incoherent policy, essentially.
I think if you look back at the polling of the last few decades, I think at various times you would see a 16-year-old be more likely to vote Conservative, more likely to vote Labour, more likely to vote Liberal Democrat. I think it isn't a party political issue in this sense. I think all parties would benefit from more votes, and I think it would depend entirely on the political context in the year of any given election, the policies that each party was proposing, which party will benefit the most. I don't think you just pigeonhole and say, oh, this party wants to bring it in because they get 50% of 16-year-old votes. Well, that could very easily dissipate, that could very easily increase for other parties. You just can't tell, it's entirely dependent. I think 16-year-olds would actually be looking at it in a more party political way and be looking at the manifestos and looking at what each party proposed. So it's not easy to just judge, no, they just want those votes. It is a matter of principle for myself, for Liberal Youth and for the Liberal Democrats. It is just an incoherent current system that we have, that we don't have the rights and responsibilities and voting at the same level. And it's to fix that problem in our system that we supported and have done for quite a while.
Yeah, thank you. On to Joe.
My question is directed to Morgan. You said in your written evidence that while it may be true that 16 and 17-year-olds will be less likely to vote than the average voter, this does not mean that they should not have the right to vote. Can you explain this further?
One argument against votes at 16 that actively annoys me is that because young people at present are less likely as a percentage to vote, that this will mean that the overall turnout will decrease as a percentage. So say turnout is 50% exactly, you introduce 16-year-olds voting and they voted, say, 40%, then overall turnout decreases to 48%. And that is not by any stretch of the imagination an argument against votes at 16. For one, if it's their right to vote, then it's their right to vote. If it's their right, it's also their right to not vote, so we can't judge it based on turnout. Second, it would still mean that the overall number of people voting increases, no matter what happens, the actual percentage. So if it did decrease to 48%, that's because you've added in several million more voters, and that can only be a good thing in my mind. So that's what comes behind that thought. It is just a defence against a particularly pointless argument against votes at 16, I think.
Thank you.
No, please.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with that argument, essentially. But I would also think that I slightly disagree with the idea of introducing votes at 16 as a standalone thing, because I actually think that it could be quite dangerous to introduce it as a standalone thing without any wider move towards encouraging the engagement of young people. Like I said, the habit-forming age is the age at which you are first able to vote, and that is a crucial age. And if you end up introducing votes at 16 at an age where people are even less engaged than they are at 18, and they're forming that first voting habit at that age, in later life that could go on to form a habit where they actually vote even less than they do now. So I do think that the two really need to be done together. Like I said, at the moment Labour's policy isn't clear on exactly how we engage young people more. It's easier than said than done, and the policy process is still in the development stage. But we are clear that the two need to be done together.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is from Finani.
So Helena and Morgan, statistics show that younger people are far less likely to be involved with politics. And so what made you get involved with a political party, and what was your the motivation kind of behind getting involved?
I think like a lot of young people who get involved in politics, and even who get involved in party politics, it's a single issue campaign that draws you in first. I think young people nowadays are very interested in campaigns around one single issue. I think, whether it's Save the Whales or Save my local bus route, a single issue is more tangible and you can really get involved in that. For me, it was around the time of the 2010 election, it was things like the international policy of the Lib Dems. I was really impressed by their pro-European stance, which has obviously carried through to this day. It was things like, I think it was the Iraq War, which I'm in my early 20s, a little older than most people here, I think, but that was really something that really first struck my interest in politics, because it was so dominating in the political sphere for so long. And that sort of, I think it's those big issues, whether it's big on the local scene, like it's your bus route, or whether it's big as in it's a war or it's international policy. It's those things that really draw a young person's interest, and that's what drew my interest. And that's sort of why I settled with the Liberal Democrats, I think, is because of the policies they had at that time. I read the manifestos. I read all the parties' manifestos before I voted, and I read the international section first. And I thought, oh wow, this Liberal Democrat manifesto's international section is really good. Oh, and wait, I agree with everything else in here as well. So it's quite an easy choice for me to make, and that's sort of how I think a lot of other people got involved in politics. I was actually asking some other Liberal youth members, and there were a lot of similar answers about these sort of big issues that they faced in their lives. There's also, if you get interested in like an issue, say a bus route or mental health or any other particular issue, quite often you get drawn into party politics because you realise that's the way to make a change in this system. A lot of young people nowadays, young people are quite likely to do things like sign petitions, go on demonstrations, write to their MPs, more than join political parties, but to be really effective quite often on the bigger issues, getting involved in party politics makes sense. So I think that's my story.
I think mine's pretty similar. I was an issue that is kind of really close to my heart is violence against women, and both domestic violence and also sexual violence. And it's something that from the beginning just engaged me in the process because I came to a realisation that the current status quo just wasn't okay, and the only way that we could change or attempt to change the current status quo was through the political system. And through that I got involved in my local Labour Party, and then Young Labour more. But so as you said, I think single issues really do often engage people, but I think it's interesting that the person who was giving evidence before us, I didn't catch his name, but he was saying there's a lot of examples where young people are involved in single issue campaigns locally, but then they don't go on to become involved in politics more widely or more nationally, or party politics for that matter. So I think whilst kind of our experience of how we got involved in politics is interesting, I think we're the exceptions, we're the people who have ended up getting involved. And I think it's really important that we look at why people are getting involved in local single issue campaigns and then not getting involved in party politics and not getting involved in wider politics, because the current system obviously isn't working, because there would be more of us sat here today. So yeah, I think for me it was violence against women that got me initially involved, but I think we are kind of exceptions to the rule.
Definitely. So why do you think you're involved when many other young people aren't?
It's a good question. I don't think that's just an issue that affects young people. I mean, you mentioned that we're the exception, that we're members of political parties. We're also an exception in the vast majority of the population. You look at any age group, I don't think there's going to be any one where a majority or even a very high percentage of people are members of political parties. I don't think it's necessarily just a youth issue. I think political parties currently have a problem with, and all parties, every single party, has a problem with getting people active in that, in party politics itself. I think part of it is, I was listening to Nick Clegg speak once, and he was talking about things like Prime Minister's questions, and it's this sort of jousting of politics that sometimes really engages with some people, but leaves the vast majority of the population just utterly confused and a bit cold and not interested in sort of the more combative elements of politics. They want to fix things, they want to get involved to solve things, and sometimes party politics just looks like a lot of people who all have the same opinions arguing with each other. And it's not, because I've argued with a lot of other people in different parties, and I know we all disagree on many, many things. But we are all interested in fixing things in the end. I think it's a perception problem that parties have generally that affects every age group, not just young people. But young people are unfortunately worse at the moment. So it's why I actually think that as part of political education, which is a vital issue, part of that does need to be party political education, teaching about the structures of parties, teaching about what each different party thinks and feels. It's why I think things like mock elections are a fantastic idea. I remember when I was 14, 15, my high school held a mock election. The Lib Dems won. I was very proud. And I think that's a really good way of getting people involved in party politics, because at the moment we often talk about themes and issues and rights and responsibilities, but we often forget that parties are the way to access a lot of those.
Definitely. So should we move on to Helena?
Yeah, so as I kind of touched upon earlier, I think that the reasons young people are disengaged in politics are not that dissimilar from why people as a whole are disengaged in politics. Like we've seen as a growing trend in the last few years, all generations are growing frustrated and angry at mainstream politics. We've seen that in the recent elections as well. So I think it's this perception of politicians not standing up for ordinary people, politicians breaking their promises. I don't think £9,000 tuition fees is going to help us get more young people involved in that sense. But like I said, I do think we have to be really careful about how we talk about young people's issues and how we pigeonhole young people. One thing that we were doing in Young Labour that we've started to change, because we realised it was kind of evident of this, was when we go out canvassing, for example, and we knock on the door and a young person or someone who is quite clearly below 18 opens the door, we'll often say, oh, are your mum and dad in? And then just a simple, small thing like that is just turning young people off from politics and saying, actually, we're not interested in you, we're not interested in your views. So that's something we're changing now in the Labour Party. So I think the reason young people are disengaged is not that dissimilar from other people. How we change that is a very difficult question. I don't think we have all the answers to that. Politicians don't, or it would have been solved. But giving votes at 16 would be a step towards changing that, because it would be empowering people. So people are turned off at the moment who are 16 to 18, but there's no way of expressing that disenfranchisement with the system. And if you give them the vote, at least they can express, they'll be empowered to express that they're angry at the system and show what they would like changed in the system.
If we just move on to Thea now, just to let you know we have about 15 minutes left, just to be conscious of that when you're giving your answers. Thank you.
Your generation is the first that has had access to the internet, including social media, for almost all your lives. How influential was that in making you get involved in politics?
Very influential for me. One, I think a lot of young people will get involved through things like social media, because you can go on a petition site and share it to Facebook a lot more easily than go out canvassing with your local MP. It's this attitude of, I think it's collectivism things, online activism that sort of helps people engage with issues sometimes more than they can parties. Personally, it was really useful because as a young member of a political party, I wonder if Helena had the same experience, quite often your local party will be full of members who are a lot older than you, and you can be one of a very small group of under 25s, even under 40s, who are actually members of your local party. So when you have things like in Liberal Youth, we have online groups, we have Twitter, and you can meet and talk to people who think the same as you, who are of a similar age to you and have similar experiences to you. So I think it helps young people who are interested in party politics get in touch with each other more easily. So I think it helps both in not more issue-based things like petitions, and it also helps you just stay involved.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think without wanting to generalise too much, young people are much more engaged with social media than older people, and inevitably that's going to have an impact on how involved they get in politics and how aware of the issues they are. So from that point of view, I think Young Labour has the same kind of experiences as Liberal Youth in terms of young people feeling like because of the low levels of engagement, they feel like not many of their friends are interested in politics. Maybe it might be a bit weird to take the first step and join a political party or get involved in some other way. And having that online presence of a wider body of young people that are involved really kind of motivates them and encourages them to get more involved. And I think that's something we could also utilise if we were going to move towards votes at 16. So we should really make great use of social media to educate young people. It's so easy to create a website that's really educational and that could then be used as a resource in schools. So I think that moving forward we should take that into account and recognise how important social media is in the lives of young people at the moment.
Thank you. Sadia has the next question.
How did political youth organisations help to get young people involved in politics? Both of your views on that.
Yeah, so as a kind of mechanism, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So there are kind of two ways that people get involved I can only speak about the Labour Party. I don't know about the mechanisms in other parties, but sometimes people get involved with their local party first, and sometimes people get involved with their local Young Labour group first, which tend to overlap a bit, but that's how people generally get first involved. And then through that you kind of learn about the issues that are in politics, but more often than not I think people come to that with an understanding of issues already, and it's more that making the leap from your local party, making the leap from being an ordinary citizen to being a member of a political party is not the leap that we need to be worried about. I think that the leap that we need to be worried about is getting people to a stage where they're engaged enough to even think about joining a political party. So I think that the political parties as a whole need to do more about this, in talking to young people, making sure they don't dismiss their concerns, making sure that they speak to young people in a way that isn't patronising, like the example I used earlier of not speaking to people on the doorstep who are young people. So as mechanisms, there's a limited amount the actual party structure can do, because I think the crucial step is getting people to actually want to join or be even remotely involved in a political party in the first place. So I think the way that you do that is by what a party's saying to young people, the attitudes they're expressing towards them, again, this kind of perception that there are young people's issues and young people only care about those issues and nothing else.
I would agree with what Helen said. I think also it's worth noting that the Lib Dems and the Liberal Youth run quite successful freshers campaigns. So most universities in their first week will have a freshers fair, so you can join different political societies, and if you have a Liberal Youth Society there or a local Liberal Democrat Party, they often take part in that, and that's the way you can, some people have their first contact with a party literally standing in front of you sometimes, so that's one mechanism for actually getting people directly involved, because you have the opportunity to talk through the issues with someone. It can be difficult to do that with 16-year-olds because it's hard. Not many, sixth form colleges and high schools don't tend to have things like freshers fairs. Sometimes FE colleges do. So quite often you go to an FE college and you just have a stand and you talk about the issues there. You tell them about your campaigns, things like that. So there's also the sort of more technical side of it.
Can I just add? I think it's really important that we remember that not all young people go to university, so yeah, obviously freshers fairs are really important, but often the people that we want to engage most in the political process are those who, for whatever reason, can't access these really traditional means. So I think as parties, that's something we really need to look at more. How do we engage the people who maybe aren't in mainstream education systems? And I don't know how we do that, but I think that that's something might be worth considering in your report.
It's hard because in things like, if you're doing people in work or an employee or who aren't in education, you don't have as much of a captive audience. Like if you go to a freshers fair, there are lots of young people gathered together. You go to an FE college or a sixth form, there are lots of young people gathered together. It's finding ways to get involved with the more diffuse groups of 5 apprentices here, a couple of people who are employed there, people who are working in you can't just go to Sainsbury's and chat people up and ask them about politics. So it gets more complicated when you talk about small groups.
Thank you. The next question is from Louise.
Hi. How much of a factor was citizenship education in deciding to get involved in a political party?
So could you just repeat that? I didn't quite hear.
How much of a factor was citizenship education in deciding to get involved with a political party?
So the kind of education that we both had at school.
Yeah, and how did it affect you?
There was the school I went to. There were some really good citizenship teachers. Two spring to mind, and the rest of the education we had on citizenship was just non-existent and really bad. And I think the main problem behind that being that we don't really have a rule that says only people trained in citizenship education should be giving citizenship education lessons. I think that applies to PSHE and sex education too. And obviously this is my personal view, but I think we need to move towards a system where being a citizenship or a PSHE teacher is a respected thing, something that teachers want to go into, something that teachers maybe are properly qualified in and do with most of their time. And also, despite the efforts of some really good teachers, citizenship just didn't have the time on the curriculum that was necessary to give it the justice it required. Not only were people kind of not really trained enough to give the education, but there just wasn't the time. We're talking 1 hour in one term, and you're supposed to be trained with everything that you need. And I also think that, like, being a citizen, it's not just Parliament, how you vote, democracy. I think, personally, we should have a fully comprehensive citizenship system where you have comprehensive sexual relationship education, financial education, so you know how to manage your own finances, and everything that being a citizen involves, because you don't come out of school knowing how you pay your electric bill or
so a wide range of...
Yeah, exactly. That's personally what I think. As I said, Labour is still in the policy development process, but that's personally why.
With me personally, it wasn't so much political education. Sort of got me interested in politics because we sort of discussed some of the issues. Like, I'm from Wales originally. We have a slightly different system to England, but a lot of it was about Wales' place in the world and the sort of the international element of that. So that was something I was quite interested in. We covered very little about party politics. We did almost nothing about how the structures of the House of Commons work and how you actually vote and what a constituency is. So it didn't really help me deal with those elements. It triggered my interest, but it didn't take me to the next stage, which I think things like mock elections do. I think that helps you get more involved in the direct actions of politics. So I think present political education sort of takes you halfway. It doesn't necessarily take the whole way. I agree entirely with Helena that things like good teacher training and teachers confident in teaching political education who are passionate about it themselves, as with other issues like sexual education, financial education, all very important. I think the teaching body needs to be improved on this. I think they do their best, but they're often not funded enough, don't have the time. There needs to be, so I think what also would help is if you had elements of political education through other subjects as well. If you occasionally would, if you even voted on issues in class, I mean, it's a way of getting people to think about how you use a vote. So I think that would help as well.
Citizenship education would help in there being a higher voter turnout.
Almost certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. If it was done properly. So, like I said before, it needs a proper place on the curriculum. It needs
regular,
Yeah, exactly. A respected qualification so that teachers actually really want to go into the discipline. Like, it should be just as respected as becoming a maths teacher or a science teacher.
Yeah.
Because obviously I think that's a lot of the recruitment problems that citizenship has at the moment, and why there is such a shortage of citizenship teachers. Having a proper place on the curriculum, being something that is just regularly on your timetable, because if there's a slot on your timetable that says citizenship, that says to you being a citizen is quite important, democracy is important, and that sends a really important message as well.
If you were writing a report, which recommendations would you make to the government regarding votes at 16, starting with Morgan?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What recommendations would you make?
If you were writing a report on votes at 16 to the government, which recommendations would you include?
Introduce votes at 16 for all elections in the UK as soon as physically possible. I think there's an argument to be made for introducing with local elections first. I've mentioned it in my evidence, but probably don't really have time to go into it. Have proper voter mobilisation, have things like registering to vote in schools, and drastically improve citizenship education. I think the best kind of citizenship education is where it's citizenship-rich curricula, where you link to things like student participation across the school and college and have wider links with the community. I think those are the key recommendations I would have, personally.
I kind of agree broadly with that. I think it's really important to look at what happens in Scotland in September, where obviously people aged 16 are being given the vote in the referendum. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at the experience there, the turnout of young people, what that turns out to be, and how the kind of ramifications of that. So that could be used as a really good case study ongoing at the moment. I think votes at 16 is something that should absolutely be introduced, but it must be accompanied by a wider engagement of young people in the political process. There are a variety of ways that possibly Labour is thinking about options to do this. It hasn't decided which is more appropriate yet, such as, like I said, proper citizenship education, a move to really get people registered to vote, mock elections in schools, and just engaging people more in the political process.
Well, thank you. I think it's just important to say that Conservative Future were unable to make today's session. However, they did provide evidence, so Conservative MPs provided evidence which we will take into consideration for our report. I'd once again like to thank both of you for coming along today to provide written and oral evidence, both of which will be used for our report. That is the end of our committee. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Order.